Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Edible Education 101, our third class meeting. I'm Will Rosenzweig. Thank you very much for joining us tonight here at the State of the Food Union. We've got a very special guest and a great topic tonight. I thought I would always begin with a little picture from my garden this morning and a peaceful thought, perhaps. And I thought I'd start with the news. I don't know if you saw the New York Times today, but just to reiterate the urgency of the issues that we're addressing, 2018 was unequivocally the fourth warmest year on record. So for those of you that believe in science, it appears that the planet is warming considerably, and as we talked about in the first week or two of the class, much more rapidly than many of the models have shown. And why that makes this class all the more important is that we've identified that there are many levers and interventions in the food system that are actually quite within our grasp to change and change rather rapidly. So we want to keep our eye on this and have it remind us why the theme for this year's class is Take Action. So in case you haven't seen that story, it's troubling, but also a call to arms for us. I also thought I would share with you, anybody watch the Super Bowl last weekend? Just raise your hand. I want to see if there are any foodies that watch football. Did you see this commercial from Devour? So Devour is a frozen food brand, and you know, the cost of a Super Bowl commercial now is over $5 million for 30 seconds. And it was interesting because they are targeting young males who probably don't cook and grab a frozen meal. And I thought it was interesting because I saw the nutrition label. We were talking about transparency last week, and all those little words, those are ingredients. So the first ingredient is sauce. And you know, Michael Pollan would be rolling over right now because, you know, he believes that we shouldn't be eating anything we can't pronounce. But the other thing that I thought was so profound about this from the manufacturer was that they were transparent. This product has 31 grams of fat in a single serving. So, and you know, it's interesting, this is a product that's getting a lot of support and a lot of sort of cultural oomph to make it attractive and noteworthy. And if you look at the ingredients and you look at both the health impacts and the climate impacts of what's in this product, it's exactly in the bullseye of what we kind of need to change. So that struck me as, you know, I thought it was a bit tone deaf for the trends that we're discussing, but nonetheless, these very large food companies with these very large brands are still pushing this as a sort of a cultural lifestyle opportunity. The third piece of news that I just wanted to share with you was a report that just came out this morning. Eating breakfast is not a good weight loss strategy, scientists confirm. It quotes our illustrious colleague, Marion Nestle, reminding us that most of the studies that were created to promote eating breakfast that as being good for you were funded by big food companies that make cereal products. So again, tying back to Urvashi's lecture last week about all that we don't know about who's creating the information that's influencing our choices, it's important, again, for us to develop this kind of skeptical, rigorous X-ray vision and do our homework and make sure that the choices that we make are aligned with our own values and what we hope to manifest in the world. So I was reflecting a lot on what Urvashi was talking about and thinking about a lot of what comes with transparency is a notion of trust. And I was thinking about, like, well, who do you trust? Who can you trust? Who's trustworthy in food? And I was thinking it would be probably a good assignment for each of us to develop some list of trusted resources who we can depend on, who are leading us in an ethical and evidence-based way. I would say that all the people that we bring to this class to speak to you, for me, fall into that category. That's one of the criteria for getting invited to this class. But it's really critical that we develop the discernment, because we're taking so much for granted. And I was just struck by Urvashi's comments about how little oversight there actually is to the food system, and how much we just rely on expecting that things are being done in the proper manner. You'll remember the first week I introduced to you this model of how innovators and entrepreneurs and change makers go about taking sort of a seed of interest or curiosity, immersing themselves in the questions, reflecting on what they're learning, integrating kind of disparate types of information, and then creating an action plan. Entrepreneurs call that pattern recognition, and I hope you're going to start to see patterns emerge. Our speaker tonight, Daphne Miller, Dr. Daphne Miller, is really one of these people who I think follow that cycle in a beautiful array. And she, as a physician, really reached outside of the box of her conventional training as a doctor to start to understand a lot of the adjacent and what you might call root causes of the ailments of her patients. And her curiosity, I think, linked between being a gardener and a doctor led her to the soil, and in that capacity has made a lot of really interesting discoveries about how our health and the health of our own biome is linked to the health of the soil. I was thinking about this too, this very complex diagram about the food system with all of its interdependencies, all of its causal loops, all of its feedback, and traditionally how siloed. You read that in the articles that Daphne assigned for you, that even 8 years ago, I was struck by the article that you assigned from the report 8 years ago linking agriculture, nutrition, and health together. And the authors were saying, gee, these three silos don't talk to each other that often, but there's a real opportunity to. What struck me was there was no mention of climate change 8 years in that organization. So it feels like the conversation is proceeding. So a lot of the people that you're going to hear this semester in the course are people that are really breaking down these silos. And I like to come back to this, the systems dance, because I think tonight, in particular, reading Daphne's work, her reflections, I just wanted to highlight 4 of these for you to pay attention to closely, because I think they really come alive in what Daphne's research and her action have informed. So listening to the wisdom of the system, not just our human biological anatomical system, but the whole system, the whole ecosystem that we exist in. Locating responsibility in the system. I love this notion of paying much more attention to the rhizosphere. I haven't really thought about that, but I think spending more time there is a great idea. Paying attention to what is important, not just quantifiable. And one of Daphne's papers, she talked about how if you just search the research databases for these connections between soil health and human health, it's very nascent, but it's growing quickly. You mentioned Justin Sonnenberg too, and he was here 2 semesters ago, and if you're interested in his presentation, it's online. Expand the boundary of caring. I really appreciated that from the Hippocratic Oath. and what doctors do. And then, of course, as a gardener, hold fast to the goal of goodness. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Daphne Miller to the podium. Thank you for coming, Daphne.
Thank you, Will. Thank you. Good evening. How is everybody tonight? I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm getting oriented here. So first I want to start by saying thank you so much for that introduction, but don't trust anything that I'm going to say tonight. Please double check me and do your own research on this, because that is really what you're supposed to do as scholars. I just want a show of hands to start with here. How many of the folks who are still in the process of getting educated here, how many are interested in some kind of career in human health? Oh, quite a few of you. Okay, keep your hands up for a sec, because how many of you might be interested in a career in ecology or agriculture or earth sciences or something? Another bunch of you. So my one goal for this evening, if I have one goal, is to get you guys to start talking to each other and start collaborating now at this level of your education and come up with good projects and good ideas. You can find each other after this lecture and begin to work, even starting tonight. So this is me, not just yesterday, but quite a few years ago, in 1993, I think, to be exact. And I am a young intern at Natividad Medical Center in Salinas, that is, a little bit south of here. And I went there directly after medical school to do a rotating internship. And after I got through the panic of being this young doctor in the hospital, just trying to put out one crisis after another, I started to realize where I was geographically in California. I had actually come from the East Coast to do this internship, didn't know California that well. And this is where Salinas is located. It's located in the middle of California's breadbasket, in the middle of about 300,000 acres that produces most of the vegetables for this country and is one of the 10th largest growing regions, if you include the rest of the Central Valley, in this country. Without this area, we wouldn't have artichokes or cilantro or carrots or many other things, or strawberries. And as I was doing my work in this hospital, it started to dawn on me that pretty much every patient I was taking care of had been harmed in one way or another by our food system. It was, sometimes very directly, patients who came in with organophosphate poisoning, or who were farm workers, or injury from farm equipment, or women who had been abused in the field. Sometimes it was more indirect, like the unbelievably high rate of fetal teratogens or malformations that we were seeing in that region, or just the poverty experienced by the farm workers, or on the other end, the obesity from not being able to, in diabetes, from not being able to purchase these fruits and vegetables that were being grown in that region. And the more research I started to do as a young doctor, the more I realized that our food system was not just harming the patients I was seeing there, but this was something that truly was national. And since the beginning of the Green Revolution, when we have this incredible uptick of corn and soy production in this country, we're also seeing these kinds of trends of this incredible uptick in diabetes and this incredible uptick in things like food-related allergy and asthma in the same time period. And as you know, correlation is not causation. I can't prove that these things are related. But when you think that the raw materials that we were growing, this corn and soy, really are the ones that have gone into these other epidemics, it really does seem like they are incredibly related. So here I was as an intern, supposed to do things like, assist in appendectomies and deliver babies and so on. And I'm running around the hospital asking other doctors, this food system is harming our patients. How can we make a better food system? How can we create a healthful food system? And I'm pretty much told, get back to work, Miller. It wasn't something that we were thinking terribly much about in those days, and certainly had no training in medical school about it. I had one day in medical school where we learned a little bit about nutrition, and it had to do with hanging a total parenteral nutrition bag for a patient in the ICU. That was it. So, I did what you guys would do in that situation. I went to the internet, which, at that point was very, 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 nascent. There was really hardly anything on it, but there was a PubMed already at that time. And, started to research then. And over the years, I've been trying to do that more and more to understand what are the connections between our, our health and our soil health. And, if you go even now and put in that soil health and human health, and I don't want you to necessarily do that during this lecture, even now, these are the kinds of hits that you get, if I were to put them into a word cloud. It's things like metals and environmental toxicity and lead and tetanus and, different kinds of infectious disease and so on and so forth. That is the connection that we're mostly making in healthcare. And so I started to think, this is not really where I'm going. There's very important research going on, and I think you're going to hear from some of those people who are looking at the pathological connections between our food system and our own health, who are looking at all the terrible, sort of downstream effects. I wanted to turn the question on its head. I wanted to start to ask, how do you create a healthy or healthful food system? So I realized that I had to move beyond PubMed. And I started to actually go out and learn from farmers across the country and across the globe. This was taken just last week with Tom Wiley and Alan Sano, who are two farmers in the Central Valley. Here I am with the Kaisers. I don't know if any of you know them up in Sonoma. Karen Washington is a very well-known urban farmer in the Bronx. Here's Bibi Rane, who is on the Bangladesh border in the eastern part of India. Sir Bernadette, who is a nun in Italy in the Marche region. So these are the kinds of folks that I've spent the past bunch of years learning from. And what I've realized is that conventional or organic, vegetable grower, rancher, pretty much every farmer you talk to, their story and their interest in their farm starts with the soil. And the more I started to learn from these farmers, I learned that there were some really core principles there about how to maintain a healthy soil in order to maintain a healthy farm and, by extension, a healthy community. I learned another thing, too, by the way, which is that farmers are very receptive to having people come and visit them, but they're not receptive to people from Berkeley who actually think they know about the food system. So that was also a very important lesson for me. So the three principles that really do govern how a lot of these farmers think about soil is that they think that they need to feed the soil, they need to protect the soil, do things to protect the soil, and they need to do things to actually conserve resources in the soil. And granted, these mean very different things for different farmers, and we're going to get to that in a minute, but I want you to hold on to these three ideas. Because in fact, these three ideas are exactly what link our health to the health of agriculture and to the health of soil. And it's on these three ideas that we can start to build a healthy food system. And in fact, when people talk about, oh, you know, there's these wonderful parallels between soil health and human health, I say, no, that's not the case. They're completely interconnected. And I hope that I'm able to show you that in the next little bit. So to show you that, let's go here to the Ozarks, to Missouri, and specifically to Norwood, Missouri. And let's go to this ranch, Rockin' H Ranch, okay? And then let's go into a farmhouse there. And this is Cody Holmes and Donnell Holmes. And it's their farmhouse. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story, specifically about Cody, because this was his ranch. He actually grew up on the ranch. And it had always been a cattle ranch. And, you know, they produced other things over the years. But at a certain point, he had to leave the ranch and actually get work in town because he could not afford to keep his ranch going. He was actually losing money as a rancher. And the reason he was losing money was because he was buying so many inputs, so much off-ranch product in order to keep his ranch going. There was the feed that he needed, and the antibiotics, and the dewormers, and the growth hormones, and you know, even the cattle he had to buy. And then on the other side, there was a large amount of cattle loss from certain diseases, and the supplements. And he was realizing that this whole system wasn't working, and he was going broke. But what was bothering Cody the most was that each year when it came time to put his cattle into the squeeze chute and start to inject them with these different things, he was keeping one young calf out, and that was the one he was reserving to actually feed to his own children. That was the calf he was not injecting with all these hormones and antibiotics and so on. So he said, there's a deep kind of hypocrisy going on here, and I need to change the system. And so he started to go and read books like the one on the table by folks like André Voisin and Alan Savory. And he realized that there was a way to run cattle around his 1,000 acres where he would not only need to stop buying all those inputs, but he could start to actually rejuvenate the soil and rejuvenate the ranch. And the system is called mob grazing. Is anybody in the room familiar with that? Has anybody worked on a ranch that does that? So the idea really is this, that you use your cattle as these, you know, as this band of fertilizers who go around from paddock to paddock, and all you really need is electric fencing to make this happen. And as they are in each paddock, they drop all their fertility into the soil, they disturb the soil, they eat the forbs and the perennials that are there, and they actually keep the system going and rejuvenate the soil. And it's really imitating the way that wild animals, such as the bison, used to graze around the Middle States before they became extinct. It's this way of growing animals and growing soil and grass at the same time. And the bison don't, or his cattle don't come back to that same paddock again until a whole year has passed and there's a chance for it to become rejuvenated. So you know that system of grazing you're used to where the cattle are sort of just, you know, smattered, you know, they're kind of scattered around the landscape? That is something that Cody refers to as Mayflower grazing. That's something we started to, you know, do in this country when we had sort of endless territory and didn't think that we had to rejuvenate soil and so on. So he has turned to this form of mob grazing. And as a result of that, his soil has come to life. And also as a result of that, he's been able to stack a whole farming system on top of the soil. Now, when you hear the word stacked system, maybe some of you are thinking about this, because this is actually a form of stacking agriculture that's happening in urban areas now. But this is not at all what Cody refers to as stacking, or what many other, this is happening around the country now. A lot of farmers are thinking this way. And what they're doing is they're basically starting with the principle of soil and soil life, and then they're growing plants on top of that, and then they're putting animals on that, and then they're getting products from that, and they're doing other things like agritourism on top of that, and they have all these layers or stacks of revenue that grow out of the soil. And you know, this is a piece of pasture on Cody's ranch before the cattle come back to it. This is what it looks like right before he lets them into it. And by the way, this is filled with native grasses, which he did not plant, but which started to come back spontaneously to that area as a result of this rotational grazing. And then here's the gardens that he would grow once the animals left and put their fertility down. These are the kinds of produce he'd pull out of it. These are the chickens in the chicken tractor who would go after the cattle had left and, you know, end up eating a lot of what was left and also putting their fertility down. These are the goats and the sheep that would come after. And by the way, he also had a little side business raising the sheepdogs too, so that should have been part of the stacking. These are the horses that would go after them, and then the goats that would go after them, and the goats were used to clear the stuff that the cattle didn't want to eat, because the cattle are a little picky and selective. And the turkeys, of course, during Thanksgiving, and oh, that's me with the pigs. Those are the t-shirts that Cody gives away that say, "I love vegetarians," and I don't know if you can get it, but it's kind of tongue-in-cheek because all the animals that he's raising are vegetarian, and he likes to eat them. And then here's the raw milk that is another product from the farm, and finally, this is the slow food from Springfield, their group that comes and does tours around the farm. They're the final stack, and they buy all the products on the farm and buy the CSAs and so on. So that is your stack. But the story starts here in the soil. Now, just to remind you, feed, protect, and conserve. So what does this have to do with our health and with our bodies? You can start to guess from the story I just told you and all those lovely products that are coming off the farm. But to really start to understand this, let's move about 1,800 miles west to learn a little bit more about the feed part. Actually, this is another picture of Cody with his feeding. But now let's move 1,800 miles west. And here we are in Coalinga. Anybody from that region here near the Central Valley? And this is Jeff Mitchell, who actually is a professor at UC Davis. And he's in the School of Agriculture. And he works in ag extension. So he plays a very important job. He is sort of the interface between research and farmers in the community. And, you know, really there to help them, you know, apply best practices and also to use their farms to do research. Ag extension agents historically have been very influenced by the agri-industry and, you know, using certain kinds of chemicals and inputs and so on, kind of like pharmaceutical reps are in medicine. But Jeff is not at all like that. And Jeff is an incredibly forward-thinking ag extension agent. And the question that Jeff has been pursuing for 20 years here in 5 Points with those field plots is how can we grow enough fruits and vegetables in California to feed this nation? And how can we do it using a minimal amount of water and fuel and not losing carbon from the soil and using a minimal amount of fertilizer and chemical inputs and herbicides and pesticides and so on. And you know, his goal is to really see the productivity in the Central Valley and in the Salinas region double, because in fact, in order for us to be food secure as a nation, we need to do that. We are not growing enough vegetables in the US to feed, for everybody here to meet the USDA requirements. And even with the amount that we're importing from places like Mexico and China, we're not reaching those goals. So Jeff's mission is an incredibly important mission. And what he has found is a lot of different things over the years. And I'm oversimplifying it here. But he's found that the most important thing he can do in order to make that soil produce a higher yield is to feed it properly. And it's not to feed it chemicals and things in a bag, but to feed it real food in the form of vegetables. And that is what cover crops are. And so he has been studying cover cropping and various treatments related to that, and how that results in a richer soil and more productive output. And what he has found is that when you use cover crops, you get a much higher microbial abundance in that soil. And as you see here, NTCC is no-till cover cropping. And you can see at the 5-inch depth that there's, on the y-axis is measurement of microbial abundance, that it's incredibly high for cover cropping. But even when you till with cover crops, you get more microbial abundance. So for whatever reason, cover cropping is very, very important for enriching the soil. He's also found that the diversity of microbes in the soil is much greater with cover cropping. And this is cover crops in both of these, but no-till versus standard till. So no-till plus cover crops is even more powerful. And this is a research that he's done. So this microbial abundance from feeding the soil translates directly into our nutrition. Now, why is that? Because other researchers have found that the more microbes you have in that soil, the better they are at scavenging those nutrients through the rhizosphere and passing them on to the plants and then on to us. So feeding the fields, building that microbial abundance, immediately passes those nutrients back to our bodies. And this is studies that's been done in strawberries, looking at strawberries that were in 3 different production systems. The ones that had the most cover cropping and the most sort of application of that, feeding the soil and conserving soil, also ended up giving the highest nutrient density. This is very curious because there's lots of controversy out there about whether organic production gives you more nutrients. And it turns out that maybe not. But when you actually apply these methods, organic or conventional, of using cover cropping and building microbial abundance, then you do get more nutrients in the fruits and vegetables that you're growing. So there is a direct feedback there. And you see that on Cody's farm with the beautiful produce that he's growing. But there's other ways that these microbes actually also play an important role. Here you see his cattle. And when you look at the nutrient density, it's not just of fruits and vegetables, but when you look at the nutrient density of his cattle, it is also higher. They have higher omega-3 fat levels. They have higher alpha tocopherol levels. This is research that came out from Cynthia Daly at Chico. More omega-3 fat levels, and so on. Do we know exactly why? Not totally clear. Is it, once again, that these cattle are somehow, that the microbes are impacting their gut? Is it the nutrient density of what they're eating? But it turns out that cattle that are in this system also have a better profile of meat. Now, I should add that these studies were done comparing cattle that actually had the same genetics. So you can't argue that it was the genetics that gave better nutrient density, but that it actually has something to do with them being in these systems. Is it the grass that they're eating, no one actually knows yet what the secret sauce is that creates the better nutrition. But there's something about the whole system that works. The same thing for the eggs. When you look at the eggs in Cody's system versus in a sort of conventionally confined system, and look at the nutrient density there, the green line being the pastured eggs, you see that they have much higher levels, once again, of omega-3 fats and beta-carotene and lutein and zeaxanthin. What is causing this? We don't know. Is it just that they get out and exercise? Once again, does it have to do with the microbes? And I just wanted to bring this full circle. These same nutrients are also really important for us. So, in terms of thinking of the full cycle. So it's not just the microbes. There's also this question of the diversity of foods that come off of these farms. If you were to eat from Cody's farm versus a farm that is just growing carrots, let's say, you're actually getting a much more a diverse nutrient profile, obviously. And as we found, diversity is, in terms of your diet, is probably one of the most important things. So when researchers measure what is an optimal diet, what is a healthy diet, they found that diversity over and over again is probably the best indicator. It's not actually going and measuring this nutrient or measuring that nutrient, but actually, are you eating, a large spectrum of whole foods, not donuts or things like that. But study after study shows that dietary variety is really, really important. That's coming out of NYU, Marion, I think. I know. But over and over again, you look that dietary variety is probably the best indicator of a healthy diet. And so, once again, you eat from these farms where you have this incredible diversity, and you yourself are getting it. Why is that the case? Why does dietary diversity make you healthier? Well, on one level, it just makes sense because you're getting more nutrients from various things, and they're probably all interacting in various ways that you don't even know of on your plate. The lemon is making the iron more bioavailable in your spinach. And the yogurt is interacting, or other fermented foods are interacting in different ways with the bulgur. So when you have this dietary variety, it's incredibly important. Diversity of diet coming off these fields also seems to impact our gut health. So this might be a little bit of a stretch, but I thought I would go there with this, that now we're starting to see that kids who are raised in regions where they have access to diverse diets and lots of plant-based foods and agriculture actually have microbial profiles that are, surprise, surprise, better at digesting and absorbing the nutrients from vegetables. And this was a study that was done in various Asian countries looking at the microbial profile of the guts of these various children. And what they found was that children who were living in Bali and Yogyakarta and Konkan, which are much more rural communities, had a microbial profile that they were actually calling a P-type profile, which is the ones on the right. And that overall, that microbial profile in their gut seems to be more aligned with being able to absorb nutrients from a diverse vegetable-based diet. So big surprise, your gut bugs are what you eat, and potentially also what your soil looks like. So just to bring you back, we started with feeding the soil a diversity of fruits and of vegetables, growing a diversity of bugs, from that stacking on that this whole diversity of animals that can be fed from that soil, and how that affects our nutrition and our gut. It all works together in this crazy way. And to close out that idea, I had to put this woman's face, Her name is Stephanie Zydembos, and she's actually working with the Yale School of Nutrition, who is studying her ferments that are coming off of a regenerative farm. So she is harvesting vegetables from a regenerative farm, using the indigenous yeast and bacteria that are just there on those vegetables, fermenting them into these products that you buy. Her stuff's called Micro Mama. She's in Ware, New Hampshire. And now Tufts University is studying these microbes that are in her ferments that are literally the expression of the soil from these regenerative farms. So this is the big cycle of what happens when you feed the soil, like Jeff is doing. And I had to add this last little idea about feeding in there, which is that I just published a study with Philip Stark and Kristen Rasmussen and Tom Carlson, who are both faculty here, looking at the nutrient density of wild foods such as weeds that are actually growing around the Bay Area. And we found that, in fact, if you compare a lot of these weeds to kale, they really knock the socks off of kale in terms of things like calcium and vitamin A and vitamin C and so on. And they're all edible weeds. And if you backtrack and look at what's growing in this field, guess what? It's all the same weeds that we studied around the Bay Area. It's the mallow and the oxalis and dandelion and different kinds of brassica and radishes and all these different things that you can pick out of the sidewalks. So we actually know how nutrient dense this stuff is that Jeff is feeding his soil, which in turn is going to somehow grow us more fruits and vegetables in the Central Valley. So let's move on to the idea of protect. And does anybody know what this is? There's only like 2 of them in California. There's a bunch in the Midwest. It's called a no-till drill. And the idea is that you can plant your seeds through those cover crops that he's growing without having to, till them or get rid of them. Because, the big challenge with cover crops is it's a lot of stuff there, and then you have to get the seeds into the soil. So they had to invent equipment to deal with this. So this is a no-till drill that can do that. So this is a way that Jeff is protecting the soil, once again, by not tilling the soil and not getting this, which is what you see in about 98% of the Central Valley right now. Only 2% of the Central Valley uses cover crops consistently in growing our fruits and vegetables. So this is what you see mostly. And because this is another way that we sort of don't protect the soil, is putting things like pesticides and herbicides on them, which have their impacts downstream, but immediately when you think of soil life, in the fact that I just told you that you need all those microbes in order to scavenge nutrients, to pass them on to plants, to pass them on to us, what happens when you treat that soil with herbicides and pesticides, which are essentially antibiotics? You lose microbial life, and that has been well established. So if you protect the soil, if you use a minimum or hopefully no sides, and if you don't plow and you use the no-till drill and you cover the soil with these cover crops, how does that affect our health? Well, I just already mentioned a couple things, that we're not getting exposed to potentially the dust, that we're not getting exposed to these chemicals. But here's another interesting way that it protects our health. And it has to do with, this is a little girl, and I put her up here to sort of illustrate this. She was part of that slow food group that came and visited Cody's farm that day. And what Cody is doing on his farm is actually, pretty much directly protecting her health. And this is the researcher who has investigated that. And her name is Erica von Mutius, And she is a researcher at Munich Children's Hospital in asthma and allergy. And what she studies is the farm effect, or basically, why is it that children who are raised on these farms, like Cody's farms, have fewer upper respiratory infections, fewer allergies, less asthma, and actually now the studies have extended to other forms of chronic disease and autoimmune disease. And she's trying to understand this. And so I actually went to Munich and I visited Dr. von Mutius and asked her, what have you found in your studies? What is this profound farm effect that you have discovered? And she went over to her computer and she pulled up this image. And I've showed this image now for years. It's an amazing, amazing picture to me because it has so much in it in terms of capturing why it is that on these diverse, sort of regenerative farms where they practice feed, protect, conserve, why is it that the children stay healthy? Well, what do you see here? What are some things you see? You see a lot of exposure to different things like dust, and which is interesting because we call, in hay, we call allergies hay fever. Yeah, you see exposure to livestock. You see a really brave mom who's left her kid in the bouncy seat. You see, what do you see in the corner there? That can. Milk. Is that homogenized, pasteurized? Vitamin D added, chocolate milk? No. Well, I'm a doctor. I'm not supposed to talk about that milk too much. But my colleagues get very upset with me when I talk about that milk. But it is raw milk that came from the cow just a couple hours earlier. And by the way, the mom is going to dump it out by the end of the day if it doesn't get drunk, because she is aware that it could potentially become contaminated and create a foodborne illness. But she's going to milk again later that day or the next day and feed that to her family. And if you go out in the fields there, it looks very much like Cody's fields. So Dr. von Mutius was really interested in why these kids were so healthy. And so she descended on these farms with a whole packet of swabs. And she started to swab everything: the cows, the babies, the bouncy seat, the raw milk, the fields. And then she went to the apartments in Munich where her children with asthma and allergy were living, and she started to swab everything there. And she sent it all to the lab and started to look at what she was getting back in terms of bacteria and fungi. And what do you think she found? Well, she found that on the farms, there was this incredible diversity of both bacteria and fungi, versus the red line is the kids in the city who had allergy and asthma. It was kind of, there was a flat line. There was really no diversity at all. And by the way, the diversity that she found on the farms was not just for things like lactobacillus and Bacteroidetes. It was for things like salmonella and shigella and listeria, things that we associate with infection and disease. But these kind of coexisted with other microbes that are very benign and even protective, and they seem to all counterbalance each other when they're in a system together. So this is research that now has expanded way beyond Munich, Germany. It's called the Gabriella Collaborative. The latest studies have actually been released from the US, comparing Amish and Hutterite. It turns out that the Amish tend to farm in much more of a regenerative agricultural model, versus the Hutterite tend to use more conventional systems, more herbicides and pesticides, and actually have a little bit more monoculture going on. But they're genetically very similar, these two groups. And so it's been an interesting pair of communities to study in the US. And what they found is that rates of asthma are much lower in the Amish populations. So, okay. So this idea of biodiversity and protecting kids is something that we're seeing as we're losing diversity on the planet. We're actually seeing an increase in these diseases worldwide. So back to this idea of protect, for sure, by farming in this manner, we're also creating a lot of lung disease. And this is something that Jeff Mitchell has studied in terms of particulate matter in the air with tilling, that it actually does impact our lung health. And I wanted to put this study up here that was done by John Baums, who's in the School of Health, showing that sulfur, which is used often as an herbicide, it's used as actually as a pesticide in organic farming, is also harmful to our lungs. So it's not just things that are used in conventional farming that are problematic. So the last idea, which is this idea of conserving, is also super important. And going back to Cody versus this other form of raising animals, if you start to think about CO2, and we'll raise the idea of climate change and where our carbon is going, where do you think the carbon and the methane are going in these two systems? How about in the system on the right? Is it going up or down? Down. And the one on the left, where is it going? Up. Exactly. So very much of a carbon-producing system. Now, this guy who has actually been studying this on his farm in North Dakota, does anybody know Gabe Brown? Gabe Brown has actually been able to map this out. He's got a farm just like Cody's, and he's actually been able to map out where the soil carbon is going on these farms. And if you see, he started with no-till on his farm, and then he started to do crop diversity and cover crops. And you see the y-axis is carbon. And as he started to then do cover crops, and then do multi-species cover crops, and then bring livestock onto his farm, look at what's happening to the carbon in the soil. It's going up and up and up. So these farms create sort of a progression of carbon building in the soil. And this is another study that's a meta-analysis that just shows exactly that. Now, there is a lot of talk about how this livestock and carbon farming and cover crops and regenerative agriculture is going to reverse climate change and save the world. I'm very hopeful, and there's some models that suggest that, but these ideas are very much in their infancy, and it's really going to be up to you guys to study this and really establish where the science is there. You know, people have done it, like Wendy Silver, who's done amazing research on some, parcels of land with specific practices here in California, but this is something that we really need to sort of grow on, and it is research to make those claims that this is going to reverse climate change really at this point feel a little bit stretched and a little bit grandiose. Since we're talking about conserving, I know we only have a little bit left, but this is the Central Valley in the middle of August with 9 inches of rainfall that year. What do you see here in a carrot field? You see water being wasted. And this has direct repercussions on our health because, in fact, the water that's being wasted in agriculture is not there for us to drink. And also, as that wasted water is washed away with the nitrates, it's actually contaminating our water. So this is not Flint, Michigan yet, and this is not Burkina Faso, but we are about to enter a crisis in California where normal citizens will not be able to drink the water. And this is something that is incredibly proximal and something we're all going to start to feel. And agriculture is a huge source of this, and we need to start thinking of healthy ways to grow our food so we don't have this happen. And back to Jeff Mitchell and his no-till cover crops, he's actually discovering that those same practices conserve water. And if you don't believe it, this is a pit in the Central Valley that had cover crops on it in the middle of August. We dug down, and can you see there? Can you see along the edge? This is, you know, in 100-degree weather, you see how it's still retaining its moisture in areas, you know, by then the cover crops look like this. They're not green anymore. But these things really do make a difference. And this is Jeff at one of his study sites in 5 Points, where this is actually in Firebaugh. And so this directly impacts our health. Farmers are also starting to conserve land in this way by actually turning it back into riparian ways in these regenerative farms. And these actually impact our health as well, because when you have things like beneficial bugs and so on, you, in fact, are using less herbicides and pesticides because they decrease your need to actually fight invading animals and weeds. And I wanted to also say that conserving agriculture land also creates wild spaces where we can discover things in soil like this antibiotic. Now, this was not necessarily discovered on, you know, wild farmland, but when we preserve soil and preserve agriculture, we're actually starting to find that it is this treasure trove for things like this soil microbe that this woman writes about ended up being her chemotherapy for her cancer. So, you know, these things all come around to, in terms of protecting our health. So these ideas, feed, protect, and conserve, I want you to start to think about them in terms of our health. And this idea of building health from the soil up, just because I know this whole course is about action, I want to just go back to Cody for just 1 sec. And, you know, we have this huge conventional food system, which hopefully we're going to be able to subvert and change. I have great hope for that. But I also want us to think of being like Cody, being like the little head of the mushroom on the top there that is actually starting to change things and do things in a different way. So, you know, a place like Norwood, which historically had a lot of longevity and healthy people, but now is actually, you know, they're being impacted by the opioid epidemic, and they have these incredibly high rates of diabetes, some of the highest in the nation. And this is just diabetes. You know, if you put prediabetes on top of that, that's 25% of the population there. And so, you know, solutions like what Cody is offering are actually, you know, very important. We are now, this is the Diabetes Prevention Project that is being put forward by the CDC. And I don't know if you guys can see who they feel are the organizations who need to take charge for this, but you have things like community organizations and employers and healthcare organizations and faith-based organizations and governments, but they don't say anything about farmers. Farmers should be equally, you know, a part of this picture, and the places that we're producing our foods. I mean, this is what Cody has gotten onto the shelves of his local grocery store. That's his Real Farm Foods product. It's right next to the Dole. And guess where this is? Any guesses? It's in a Walmart, okay? So that is definitely the little head growing on the big mushroom. And, you know, this is a study that was published looking at the revenue cost for conventional versus regenerative ag. This is all the money that is saved. That white area is all the money that is saved with conventional agriculture because you're not putting all that money into inputs and so on. So that can go back into the local economy. It can go back into fair labor and paying a living wage to farm workers, like on Cody's farm. It can go back to delivering food. This is his little food delivery truck. And it can go back to building communities. And for him, it actually goes back to his church as well. So this is just one story that I wanted to tell you. There are many, many stories out there. But really how, you know, the practices that happen on a farm actually influence our health. And how we are actually a part of that, the stacking that I talked about, we are that top layer. Human health is the top layer of the stack. So thank you so much. So.
Victoria, you're on.
Oh, there was a bunch of other slides that we didn't get to.
We're going to have you back next year to finish the rest of the talk. How about that? Look at all that. Great. So, and you can hand that back to me. Yeah, great. Thank you.
All right.
So much.
Hi, everyone. Let's see, a few quick announcements, starting with weekly reading questions. They are due Sunday at 11:59. What you will see this week is that they will be disabled, so if you try to submit after Sunday at 11:59, it won't work. Don't email me about it. It's, make sure you give yourself ample time. Just saying. New to B courses, a few quick things. The prompt for the first essay should be up. That's due March 6th, so we'll talk about that in the weeks to come. But in case you're curious or want to start working on it, it's there. Of course, Will and I are both available for people who want to chat about it. You're more than welcome to email either one of us to set up time for office hours. And the Class 2 attendance from Kahoot should be posted. So if you attended last week, you should be able to see under an assignment called Class 2 that you attended. So if you don't see that now, you know that there's an issue, please email me. Moving forward, you'll see hopefully a couple days after class that will be posted. So if there's any issues, feel free to let me know. You also will be able to find when we'll post previous lectures. Those are also on the site under files. So again, if you have any questions, just let me know. A farm visit. So Will had the fantastic idea. We're doing all of this talk about farms, and it's kind of difficult, at least for me, because living in Berkeley, I never see farms. So there's an idea of us doing a farm visit in the coming weeks. More details will be posted about that, and I'm actually going to ask you more questions about that in the Kahoot. So take out your phones, laptops, whatever works for you to go to kahoot.it, and we'll all cross our fingers that Air Bears works. We'll also cross our fingers that I remember how to use a PC. Yeah. I just said that. I think last week we got up to 110. Okay. Give you guys like 10 more seconds. Oh. 110, 111? Nope. All right, let's go. 2 questions this week. So as I just mentioned, field trip to the local farm. How interested are you guys in doing it? No one's feelings will be hurt if you end up in the not interested category. So please answer honestly. And one quick, we'll see the results in about 30 seconds. But one quick announcement for people next week, just to remember, when you come into class, make sure that you try and come and fill up the bottom, because like me standing here is like kind of sad. There's only 2 people in the front row, and it looks kind of sad. So if you are coming in, please try and fill up the front before you head to the back. Just gonna say that. Huh, okay. Most people are interested. I would say more than half of people are interested. Good to know. Second question is about what you would be excited to learn more about in class. So one of our classes, I think the second to last class, April 17th, we have some flexibility in the topic for that day, and Will just wanted to get a pulse from all of you, what would be exciting. We've talked some about vertical farming has been mentioned, alternative meats is super hot. Microbiome is everywhere, even in us talking about soil health. And then it feels like food waste is also such a big issue. And so one of the things that I think would be really helpful is just understand what you guys want to know. I think so, but I'm not sure. I'm gonna I can also set it to less seconds, but I don't know what that does. I guess I can try it. No, it didn't like that. It's very finicky.
Oh, I see.
Alternative meat. Maybe food waste. All right, cool.
The microbiome.
Left turn.
Everybody's interested. There's a lot of hype.
All right, well, I will kick it back over to you.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you all for your attention. Daphne, well, thank you so much for being here. One of the things we're hoping to help the students with too is their path of action. I guess I'm wondering if you were thinking about going to medical school again now, what would you do differently, or how would you augment your education? I guess there's like, doctors get like less than 10 hours of nutrition training, and I was thinking your colleague Kristen and David Eisenberg, they're having the Healthy Kitchens, Healthy Lives conference this week. They're trying to teach healthcare professionals about food and nutrition.
About food.
Yeah.
I'm still I just came from clinic right now, which started very early this morning. And, quite honestly, I work for UCSF. I'm a family physician there. And if I get to interject a tiny conversation about food, within all the other crises that I'm dealing with in a day, then it's a nice moment. So my lives are really still very divided in an unfortunate kind of way. I don't think that our health system is still very much of a sick system. And Marion gave a wonderful talk last night and mentioned that Kaiser is one of the few organizations that actually cares about the food system, because they have to sort of take care of these lives and pay for the impact of our food system. But even at Kaiser, there's the kind of Kaiser Foundation, and then there's the medical side of Kaiser, and they're very divided. And most of the clinicians that work there don't get to work around these issues at all. So it's something that needs to come together on so many different levels. One of the projects that I did last summer was an actual farm school for doctors and other people in healthcare, and brought them to Piscinas Ranch. That soil pit that I showed you was actually part of their class, and we're going to do it with med students this spring and bring them out to Jeff Mitchell's field so they can start to learn about these field studies that are going on and how they impact soil life and nutrition and nutrient density and all these things. Because I think it's super important for people in healthcare to understand that these are the foundations of our health. And also to understand how they can both use influence and advocacy and even change the purchasing patterns of their organizations and so on to support these things. But there's still an incredible divide. That article that I gave you from 8 years ago, things have not evolved terribly much since then.
Well, one of our first conversations was you had remarked what you just told us about. You said, gee, farmers aren't necessarily aware or equipped or empowered to lead in health. It's something completely separate from what they do. And I said, well, gee, I've been teaching and working in the world of social entrepreneurship for 20 years, and I've never seen a farmer, represented as a social entrepreneur who has the potential to generate all this positive impact in the community and on the planet. So this rethinking, sort of reframing the role of these people as leaders in community and in society, I think is really profound.
And I do that. I mean, I speak to farmers a lot, and when I do, I always emphasize that they are on the forefront of healthcare, that they really are public health workers. But to get back to your other question, I actually am looking to the next generation of young doctors to really be the ones that absolutely insist that the fundamentals of health are really upstream, that they have to do with where we're growing our food and how that's being processed, and the kind of labor that we're using to grow it, and how farm workers are being treated. And all these things have absolutely everything to do with our cells and our health. And I know when I tell the story and try and connect the dots, there are moments where I get confused myself, because there is not a lot of science there yet. And yet we have to start to stick our necks out and say, look, this is the story, and these are how these things are connected. They matter. These practices matter for our health. They matter for planetary health too, of course, and that's actually where the data is stronger. But over and over again, it's been shown that people at the end of the day are pretty moved for selfish reasons. They want their own cells and their own body to be better. And so if I can start to make this, if we can all start to make the story and connect these dots, I think it's very powerful. And what it's going to truly require is for researchers to start to collaborate. So, for example, I'm going to a research collaborative on cover crops in the Central Valley on Friday morning through Saturday evening. It's a whole group of ag researchers that are getting together to try and ask a lot of these important questions around increasing productivity in the Salinas Valley and the Central Valley. I will be the only healthcare person there, pushing that part of the story. How do we layer on, if we talk about stacking, how do we layer on the health questions to this research? Now, I think that there's actually probably a lot of people who are researchers in healthcare and public health and medicine and so on, who honestly are much more qualified to do this work than I am, who actually can frame the research questions better, who have the raw materials and the labs and so on to do the studies, but they're not the ones who are showing up yet and wanting to collaborate. So that is the piece that's going to really need to start to happen, that it needs to be this intellectual curiosity that brings people together across this divide. The Lancet just came out, did you guys look at this large EAT document, which calls on a very high level for collaborations between agriculture, the food system, and human health. But I don't know if anybody's read the document. I sat down and did it. It's very long, and once again, we've got to move beyond these high-level ideas. We've got to get down into the weeds and start to understand, the flow of microbes, the flow of nutrients, how these different, very nuanced cropping patterns, because it's not just cover crop or no cover crop. It's, do you put the furrows or not the furrows? What diversity of seeds do you have? You have this window between October and February. When in that time do you do it? How much residue do you leave on the land, and so on? And all of that is actually going to have very important impacts on the kinds of food we grow, the nutrient density of that food, how agriculture actually impacts the environment in terms of the byproducts, and so on. So these are things that we should get really excited about and start to ask.
Well,
questions on from a human health standpoint.
I was getting excited about you talking about all these wild plants that are growing in the sidewalk that are nutrient dense that we call weeds.
Right.
It just immediately made me think of the rebranding opportunity for those plants.
Well, how many of you have read Dan Barber's book, The Third Plate?
I was just going to mention that Dan was here last year.
Okay, and did he?
Yeah. So I was going to kind of link that to his talk.
It's essentially the same stuff. You know, he hasn't come at it yet from a health standpoint because he's a chef. You know, but yeah, he's also not
risotto.
Yeah, there you go, rotation risotto. And so, you know, one of the questions I've been asking the researchers is they have this huge problem with residue where they get too much cover crop, and it's hard to, as I told you, it's hard to plant through it, but also it's hard to get it all worked into the soil. So how much of that cover crop can you actually take and maybe bring to market and sell for $7 a pound as this wonderful winter mix and still get all the microbial benefits and the soil enrichment and so on? No one's even looked at that, you know? So, you know, and that's a place, you know, at the nexus of human and soil health where we can start to ask these questions. That's just one example. There's many, you know.
Some of the students, you know, each week the students do the reading and then they submit questions to us. Some of the questions, it seemed that your article on gardening generated a lot of gardening envy among the students. And the students were saying, well, what do I do? How do I garden if I don't have any land, I live in Berkeley, I don't know how to do it. What advice do you have for students? How do students get involved with gardening before they have their own garden?
Well, Berkeley is a terrible place to use an example because there's a garden on every block, and there's a student garden, and there's master gardeners, and there's cracks in the sidewalk, literally, that you know, have a lot of fertility where you could go and plant a couple seeds. And if you're Philip Stark, you'd say, why should you ever, you know, why should you sow something? Just reap it, you know, because he's a forager. So, you know, there's lots of different ways, you know, to garden here. Window boxes, just, you know, a big planter. I had a wonderful experience these past 2 years of truly building my own soil in my garden. It was a garden that had been kind of destroyed, where the soil was truly concrete. And just by importing some manure, but otherwise taking cardboard, everybody's Amazon boxes, and doing the lasagna method. Has anybody done that? The biodynamic or the permaculture lasagna method, where you put a little layer of manure on this horrible, hard soil, and then you take your neighbor's leaves and you stick them on top of that, and then you take your neighbor's Amazon boxes and you stick it on top of that, and you wet it all down, and you do 3 layers of those, and then you just sit there and, you know, pray. And what starts to happen is magically, just like in Cody's, you know, land where all the native grasses came back, in my garden, all the native worms came back. And then it starts to work its way from the layers that you built down to the crappy old soil and starts to change that. So all the worms start to work their way down and regenerate that soil. And now, a year and a half later, it's just unbelievable what, you know, gorgeous, rich soil I have in a place that really, you know, looked like a junkyard.
Well,
before.
I was going to also say, if you don't have a garden, gardeners like Daphne or me or other people I know, we always need help. we always welcome more hands in the soil. Also, a lot of community colleges have courses in gardening, and you can meet other people in your community. You know, and I think there's also a lot of opportunity now for kind of intergenerational learning.
I think we have someone who's putting in a plug. Is it for Berkeley Master Gardeners or? Oh, for spiral gardens, yes. Wonderful.
Spiral
in the Gill
gardening.
Tract.
Okay, so there's no excuse now.
Right, and I've you know, there's gardens on campus too. You know, I'm sure that for anybody who desires a little plot of land, you know, your wish can be answered. It just takes a little bit of resourcefulness.
Resourcefulness, that's one of our favorite words.
The other thing is that I feel like learning from the soil has been as wonderful a teacher for me as learning from my patients. I mean, they've offered me different lessons, but you sit there and you watch a piece of land and what it does in various seasons and under your care, and it's remarkable how much that teaches you about the cycle of life and other very important lessons.
I'm going to ask some of the students whose questions we chose to come to a microphone here or there. Is Betsy, Ryan, and Carly Rick here? I see Betsy. Come on, don't hesitate. One of you come down here, please. Introduce yourself, tell us what you're studying, present your question to Daphne. You're on camera. And those of you that are watching online, if you want to try to submit a question through YouTube, we might actually be able to attempt that tonight as well.
Hi, my name is Carly Rick, and I'm a graduating senior studying conservation and resource studies with a focus on medical ethnobotany, and I'm also pre-nursing.
Wow.
Dr. Miller.
She's the embodiment
Yes.
of what we're doing.
Medical ethnobotany.
No, and pre-nursing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where are those mushrooms?
So Dr. Miller, your article, The Surprising Healing Qualities of Dirt, demystifies dirt and promotes good bacteria. However, on the other hand, E. coli outbreaks in produce like romaine are prevalent and often frighten consumers. My question is, where do we draw the line between healthy bacteria and foodborne illness? For example, do movements like the raw milk movement, which advocates for unpasteurized dairy, overshoot this idea of not sterilizing food?
So this is a question I always get, and I don't want to downplay food safety. It's you know, a really important issue and costs us, you know, billions of dollars a year in this country, and also is responsible not for actually that many deaths, believe it or not, in the US, but for a lot of trips to the hospital and doctor's offices, and certainly a lot of miserable nights you know, that are, you know, spent with gastrointestinal illness. Relatively few deaths is the truth. But when you actually look at what, you know, tracing back to the source of most causes of foodborne illness, they have to do with, you know, the sort of consolidation of food and packaged foods where these bacteria have the opportunity to thrive. And also, actually, most of them are, you know, from meat and deli products and some dairy products. Vegetable-borne illness, although it catches the headlines a lot, is a really, really small piece of it. And even that, we're not sure, is it farm workers, is it on the farm, or is it happening more, you know, in these vegetables that end up in plastic packages where things are allowed to thrive? I always go back to that diversity hypothesis that I put up there, that when you have a whole bunch of bacteria that are kind of living in a community with each other, that the good guys kind of outweigh the bad guys at the end of the day. And that what you get is this kind of healthy symbiosis, but very much like Dr. Van Mutius found on her farm with the diversity there. So I actually go back to the principles of healthy farming, that sort of feed, protect, conserve, and really trying to do that in a good way. And you know, not going crazy with it. I don't sit there and eat handfuls of cow manure, but I certainly will pull vegetables off of these farms and eat them without washing them. And I think that at the end of the day, you have to think in terms of systems and healthy systems. Rather than getting caught up so much in, you know, this outbreak or that outbreak.
What about the milk?
Oh, I don't know if I want to go to the milk
Okay,
tonight.
you're avoiding
It's
the milk.
a whole other conversation.
we'll
It's
skip.
such a hot button issue.
Okay.
I mean, if you look at the CDC website, they spend as much time talking about raw milk as they do about diabetes, for goodness sakes, which, kills, costs about $350 billion a year and kills, so many people. So I think that it is something that is, we should not be cavalier about. I don't encourage my patients to, I actually sort of think about raw milk as kind of unsafe sex. You would only do it with someone who'd been tested and who you really trusted and knew well, you know? So, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Yeah. I think that's a healthy way to think about it.
Is that a good way to think about it? Okay.
You want to know where that cow has been before you drink the milk.
But I do think that we get a little too worked up about it, honestly. Yeah.
Okay, well, we did. Good. All right. Well, how about Betsy Ryan? Where are you, Betsy? What are you studying, Betsy?
Hi, I'm studying interdisciplinary studies. And my question is, how would you rank the importance of good soil among other areas regarding health concerns? For many communities, budget and time are hard to come by. Would you recommend prioritizing soil or other initiatives first? And if soil is not first, how would you rank the order of topics of change based on the importance for a city to focus on?
In terms of, can you say the first part of that question again? I'm sorry, I didn't.
She's asking, like, how would you
soil versus what?
Yeah, like if a city's trying to prioritize. Are you talking about kind of from a public health perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah. So from a public health perspective, how should health officials think about soil, I guess, as part of a overall plan for improving community health?
Okay. Well, I think that they should think about it, period. Because it's not something, we think about it all except for as a source of lead poisoning or, toxins, or warning people not to play in it too much. So it's just not on the radar screen at all. So I hope I haven't presented the idea that this is the answer to all of our health woes, is for us to, simply think about soil. But I think that what I'm really trying to explain is that this is actually very central to our health, and that every program that we do that is related to the food system and human health should go all the way back to soil and to production and farmers. And I think of soil as literally being important for our health, but also being the metaphor for farms and that idea of thinking about healthy farms. And right now, when so many people who are thinking about food security and the food system and keeping communities healthy and serving and making sure that there's food security for underserved communities, they stop at the food delivery end of the spectrum. They focus on a little bit on nutrition education, and then sort of on sourcing food, and they don't trace it back to this idea of production. And what I just told you this evening is that we're actually not producing enough of those foods to actually feed ourselves. So we do have to trace it back to the beginning, and I think not having farms and not having healthy soil be a part of the conversation is doing a disservice from that side. Now, from a climate and environmental health side, it's also, as I illustrated, I hope, very critical, both in terms of water security and clean water and protecting ourselves from the pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers that are sort of infiltrating our water table. And even our air, I mean, that smoky air that I showed you from plowing is worse than the fire smoke that we experienced this fall. So for all those reasons, farms and soil are critical to our health. Is it the most critical issue? I would say it's one of the very important ones, but there are others too.
Thank you. Victoria, do we have any questions from the audience at home? Or if anyone else have a question, please come to the microphone here or there. Just come on down. Ask another question, Daphne. You're getting more than a 15-minute appointment here, so it's pretty generous.
Just want to say thank you very much for this talk. It was very interesting. My name is Kristen, and my question is about transparency, which was brought up in the last talk. And I asked a question to the last speaker about that as well, but I wanted to know, as a consumer, if we're not getting it directly from the farm, if that's not possible, how are we supposed to know, other than if it's organic? How else can we find out about the health of the soil for the food we're eating?
Right. So, you know, I'm sure Vashi talked about labeling, and there's a new label that's coming out that's regenerative organic, and you know, there's so many labels out there. I actually, I think that the whole system is meant to confuse consumers. And I'm not sure if we're ever going to have that transparency. I think that we really need to work on it from a production standpoint and have the confidence that we're actually doing things right on the farms and that we're all on the same page there. I mean, it's so crazy that, and I'm not answering your question here because I can't answer it. Because, you know, I used to say stupid things like, look at the shape of the vegetable, or, you know, talk to it, or smell it, or, you know, hug it and see what it says back to you, you know. Or look up the farmer and find out what he had for breakfast, although he's not supposed to have breakfast anymore, apparently. But, but it's just that it should not be buyer beware. And I feel like I get caught in this trap. It's a very legitimate question, don't get me wrong. But it should not be up to the consumer. We have to fix this system from the soil up, guys, so that we trust. In Europe, people don't talk like this. You know, it's because there is this understanding, this basic minimum of health that we use in growing our food, and we use those principles of, you know, protect and conserve and so on. So why should the consumers be the gatekeepers here? We've already been shown, it's already been shown from an economic standpoint that you're not really voting with your fork. I mean, the system is so messed up for, you know, in terms of, you know, the farmers get so little of the money, and the production of this food is so cheap that, you know, they're going to continue, you know, making the Frito-Lays and what have you. Even if the farmers double their prices, they can do that. So we need to work on the farms, really changing our growing systems, and work in the food streams and how it's getting to us. And that's when you have transparency, is really when you know how the whole chain is working, and not just when you have to sit there and look at this thing and decide if it's good, you know, good or not, with 1,000 other things that are there to fool you, like what's that thing you put up, Sublime or whatever? Devour. So I mean, sure, get to know the farmer and go to farmers markets and read the labels and all those answers. But at the end of the day, we've got to change how we're producing this food, and that is not just on, the onus is not just on you as a consumer. For some reason, the system is broken and it doesn't just work that way. We've got to go back to the source and do it that way too.
Thank you. I did appreciate.
That's a really unsatisfying
Well,
answer,
I appreciated what you wrote in in one of the articles you sent us, which was, you know, ask the farmer if they live on the farm. I mean, you could also, there are some food retailers that tell the stories of the farmers that you go into. I'm not saying it's the panacea, it's just that, but the more we can ask the right questions.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But, you know, I take care of a lot of patients during the day, you know, who certainly don't have the ability to advocate for themselves or ask those questions. And if they tell me that they've had an orange that day, I don't care where that orange was from. I mean, that's just so amazing that they were able to have access to an orange. And so I, see it from that side too. And it's not their responsibility to, make a purchase that's going to change the food system. It's our responsibility to make the food system one that can give them more oranges. So it really is a matter of turning the question on its head. Of course, as food starts to get more regional and local, then you do know, because that farmer is also your neighbor and so on. And so maybe some of you have had the opportunity to do that. But we are a transnational food system at this point, and you can't always trust that.
Right. Yeah. Did someone have a question up here? Yeah, please. Introduce yourself, please. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Cameron. I'm studying society and environment and food systems. And I wanted to ask, you said we're not producing enough food to feed the nation. However, I've heard that we actually are producing like plenty of food, and that the real problem lies in distribution of food and inequities and food waste. So could you just go into some more detail on those two contrasting?
We're not producing enough fruits and vegetables, nutrient-dense food, and nuts. We truly are underproducing, and that actually, certainly a large portion of that goes to waste too. A lot of that waste is actually because of these crazy rules about the cosmetic, how these fruits and vegetables have to look in order to actually get into markets, and all these standards. But how many of you subscribe to imperfect produce here? Yeah, which is really affordable and is all the funny-looking guys that can't go on the grocery shelves. I've heard there's a little controversy with imperfect because maybe some of those fruits and vegetables before would go to food pantries. I'm not sure, but it's still, the principle is a good one. But what we're overproducing is calories. You're absolutely right. In terms of, corn, soy, and wheat, we're, at this point, I don't know if it's 2 or 3 times the amount that we need in this country, and we certainly have plenty to export to other parts of the world. But we are not producing enough nutrient-dense food.
Thank you.
Very different. And by the way, that food is much more expensive and complicated to grow. You can't do it in a factory system. And so that's, why folks like Jeff Mitchell or this meeting that I'm going to this weekend, that's really what the idea is. How can we start to shift production in this country to the actual food that's not only for humans, but that nourishes humans? And by the way, wheat, corn, and soy are not necessarily bad for you. It's just that A, we grow too much of it, and B, we kind of grow the wrong varieties. I mean, there's a lot of farmers who are now going back to heritage, different kinds of heritage corn and heritage wheat, which just like the heritage cows is more nutrient dense. And we're not sure if it has to do with the growing system or the seeds themselves or the cover cropping or what have you. But even those big commodity crops could be grown to be more nutrient dense. Wheat could have a lot more iron in it than it does. I mean, corn could have a lot more calcium in it than it does, if we use different varieties of these. So I don't want to just say, and I love edamame, but that's not really what we're growing when we grow soy. So.
Thank you. Well, I just want to really thank you, Dr. Daphne Miller, for your curiosity, your initiative, your sector boundary breaking work. It's really inspiring. And I love hearing all of the multidisciplinary majors that are emerging out of this class, because it's that kind of connecting that is really where the answers are. So a big hand for Dr. Miller.
I just want to add, I'm here in Berkeley, and if there are students that would like to reach out and talk about their career path, I'm drmiller@berkeley.edu, and you're actually welcome to email me. So
that's very generous. And next week, very important class on the Farm Bill with Nina Ichikawa, who is the acting director of the Berkeley Food Institute, and 2 guest experts, one to give us kind of a national perspective and one to give us a very local perspective. So I'm really looking forward to that class. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.